Hello and welcome back. We're on class 11 in the World War II era now, so we're making good progress through the 20th century. We're almost halfway done with that. A lot more to do still, a lot of big stuff going on going forward. We'll talk about the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War in the 60s and all kinds of stuff like that. But today we're still on World War II. And the other day I kind of gave you the background uh, to the war in Europe, how the hostilities began with aggression by Germany and Italy, and then Japan and the Pacific, who were trying to close off those particular areas. They wanted to prevent other countries from coming in there and getting resources and trading and investing. They wanted those areas for themselves. That was going to be the basis of these kind of empires, German Empire, the Japanese co-prosperity sphere. The idea there is you close it off and then you control everything. You have access then to all of the materials, whether it be in Central Europe, in the case of Germany, or in the East Asian area in the Pacific for Japan. And then, you're set. You don't need anybody else. You can be self-sufficient, you can be autarkic, and you don't need the rest of the world in order to survive economically. You can do it all on your own. So that's the idea behind it. The US and Britain and France also see it as a threat, because that would close off these massively important areas. Asia and Central Europe are really important to the American economy. Without them, without trading partners, you're in trouble. It's like today, China and the United States have this kind of relationship where they kind of need each other because there's so much activity, economic activity going on between the two. So that in the last couple of years, as these strains have gotten worse, both countries have had economic issues because of that. So the idea in capitalism is that it's interconnected, and all these countries work with one another, and they have places where they can go abroad and they can set up American companies abroad, or other countries can come to the United States and set up business or sell goods. And you can invest abroad. Other countries can invest in the U.S. You can get raw materials from abroad. Other countries can come into the U.S. and get stuff. And that's the idea behind this interconnectedness, this open door where everybody has access to all these other countries. Well, Germany and Japan want to close that for sure. And so that's the real peril in the 1930s. And that's why the United States and the British and the French and the Germans, and we'll see in a minute, the Russians and the Japanese, all get closer and closer to conflict. And then by late 1941, you have a global war, kind of like you did in 1917 when the US entered, like in World War I. And this was going to be way bigger, way more damaging, way more people were killed, way more brutal, far more actually meaningful or consequential in the history of the 20th century. What happens in and after World War II is really critical for determining what the rest of the 20th century will look like. All right, so that's what we're going to do today. Talk a little bit about the war. I don't go over that in detail, like the military history of the war. That's in the book. Read the book. You hear it every time, but read the book for exams. Everything else, you really need to read the book. If you have any questions about it, contact Don McGinney. If you have any other questions about anything, check Blackboard, because most of the information you need will be on there. Contact your TAs; they're listed on the syllabus. Which is which, and you can always contact me, and we'll just kind of keep on top of things going forward. I know it's a weird semester. It's kind of weird for me. I'm sitting here looking at myself in a Zoom session, and I'd much rather be walking around and talking to people and getting questions and things like that. But it's a unique and very exceptional times, and so we're doing the best we can, and the TAs and I are certainly going to do everything we can to help you out as much as you need it. All right, so let's go. Let me get the outline up so that we can kind of see where we ended last time, and we can kind of go on from there. Now, I think the last thing I was saying the other day was that the United States was officially isolationist, meaning it wanted to be isolated from the world. It didn't want to be involved in the problems of other countries. And the best example of that would be, for instance, Spain. There was a civil war in Spain. The legitimate government was under attack from these fascists in the military led by Francisco Franco. And the United States did nothing, even though the government there was legitimate. It had been elected. It was a Republican government. It had broken much of the power of the Catholic Church in Spain. It had given women the right to vote for education. It expanded public education, things like that. But despite that, Roosevelt and the U.S. refused to take sides in that. And they were also under pressure from the Catholic Church in the United States, which had supported Franco, right? So there's this period of isolationism. So the United States is trying to stay out of these conflicts. It doesn't want to be dragged in to another war like it believes in 1917. People's thoughts about World War I were really important in determining what to do now with World War II. In the United States, we can look back on isolationism and say it was a huge mistake, kind of like appeasement in Europe, right? Because they should have stopped Germany, or they should have stopped Japan or Italy, as soon as possible. At the time, however, there were so many factors working against that. World War I, and we've talked about this, left a really bad impression on most Americans. They thought it was a mistake. It really didn't make the world safe for democracy. It led to problems abroad and at home. It led to a global depression. The reparations imposed on Germany, all they did was help destroy Germany and lead to the emergence of Hitler. There was this sense in the U.S. that Wilson went to war in 1917 in order to provide money, in order to make his friends who made armaments, who made weapons, part of the military-industrial complex, wealthy. So the idea there is Wilson didn't need to go to war, but he wanted to help out his friends with all these war orders. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And so the idea of isolationism is not really unreasonable. It made some sense, right? Because World War I was such a bad experience. You don't want to go through that again. So there's clearly an isolationist attitudes in the United States. But at the same time, the U.S. was doing more and more to get closer to involvement in the war. I mentioned the last thing I mentioned yesterday was it was this undeclared war where American naval ships were serving as convoys for commercial ships. Remember, in World War I, the German subs were sinking commercial ships carrying weapons or gold or goods or whatever. So you had naval convoys for these commercial ships in the Atlantic and Pacific. And with some frequency, they came into conflict with German and Japanese ships. So they're actually shooting at each other, right? And that's called the undeclared war, especially against Germany and the Atlantic, the Northern Atlantic. The other way, even bigger way that the U.S. was getting involved in the war was as Franklin Roosevelt called it, becoming the arsenal of democracy. The United States wasn't in the war yet in 1938, but it had begun building weapons. This was a way to get out of the Depression too. The U.S. had started providing contracts to all of these manufacturers who would now reopen their plants and bring workers back and put them to work in order to make the stuff you need for a war, even if Americans aren't using it. And at that point, there was no idea that the Americans would be actually in the war fighting. So basically the idea early on is to be the arsenal of democracy for other countries, countries fighting against Hitler, fighting against Japan. So Britain and France and China and eventually the Soviet Union. As part of the being the arsenal of democracy, the United States wanted to avoid again what had happened in World War I. Remember when you had all these debts and loans and all this kind of stuff. So the U.S. created a couple of programs, several, but the two I want to mention. One is called cash and carry. This was America's approach to sales of weapons. So in World War I, there were all these debts. Remember, we talked about the massive debts, which in the 1920s really created a massive problem in the global economy. So this time, instead of loaning money to the British and the French, and possibly sending your ships into the Atlantic where they get sunk, the Americans developed a program called cash and carry, which meant that if the British or the French or whoever wanted to buy weapons, they had to come to the United States. Their ships had to come to the United States, pay in cash so that there was no credit or no debit issues, and then bring them back themselves. Pay in cash and then carry it back yourself so that the American ships wouldn't be at risk of getting sunk with these weapons that they were bringing to Britain and France, right? So that's one way of doing it. They made I'm not going to talk about this much. They also made an agreement with the British to give the British a bunch of old destroyers that were kind of being mothballed anyway in exchange for a bunch of British bases in places like Canada and in the Atlantic, which were really valuable to the U.S. But the most important program in terms of helping countries fight against fascism was Lend-Lease. In order to avoid the problems of World War I with all those debts and reparations and all that stuff, the United States said instead of making loans to other countries, it would actually lend other countries the stuff they needed for the war. So you would lend them tanks, and you would lend them airplane parts, and you would lend them ammunition, and you would lend them chemicals, right? Now, of course, or lease it, you lend and lease, right? The implication there is you get it back, right? Well, clearly, if you're fighting a war, you're not going to get this stuff back. You're not going to get back bullets. You're probably not going to get back many tanks and armored cars and jeeps because they're going to be blown up. But at least that creates the idea then that the United States is not in debt like it was in World War I. It was funding the British and the French so much. Now it's going to lend or lease this equipment to other countries. And it's going to start by doing it to the British. American aid was really important, for instance, in the Battle of Bretton, when the British finally forced Japan to withdraw. I'm sorry, to Germany to withdraw. It's like a line in Animal House. Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? So no, it's Japan to withdraw. So Lend-Lease is really important in mid-1941. So the United States is becoming more and more involved up through 1939, 1940, 41. It's not committed to the war yet. It's not intervened in the war yet. But it's making a lot of stuff that can be used in the war. It's loaning goods, it's selling goods, it's leasing goods. The Americans are deeply involved. And this is probably the greatest contribution the US made in World War II was through industrialization, through factories. The Americans made so much of the stuff that was really necessary to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. Now in Europe, as we'll see, the actual fighting was mostly done by the Russians. The bulk of the fighting in World War II in Europe was Germany versus Russia. And we'll talk about that in a minute because there are a couple twists and turns there. But the Americans were really vital in providing the stuff they needed, American factories. So American industrialization was critical. Remember, like in the first or second class, I showed you that map of this, the Civil War and the differences between the North and the South. Well, it's kind of the same idea. Industrialization is critical in warfare. If you have more factories, if you have more banks, if you have more capital, if you have more railroads, if you can produce more raw materials in warfare, you need all kinds of stuff. You need copper and tin and tungsten, and obviously you need petroleum and things like that. If you can do all that, then you have a huge advantage in the war. And so in the Civil War, the North had that advantage over the South. And in World War II now, the Americans are providing that advantage with their massive production capabilities to the Allies, to the British and the French, right? So that's where the situation stands then in 1941. But then things get a lot more hectic, right? The other day, I said that Germany had called off the invasion of Britain. It had been fighting this Battle of Britain. It was hoping to subdue Britain, to defeat Britain just by using airplanes. And that didn't work. The British rallied. They developed a radar. They developed an air defense system. And finally, Germany withdrew. Germany had to call off the invasion, right? Now, one of the main reasons did that. One of the reasons, obviously, is that Britain had, pushed them back, had stopped them. But another reason, and this would, in the long run, be Hitler's gravest error, biggest mistake, was that the Germans withdrew and then moved their troops to the east. Western Europe is over here. That would be France, and where the Germans had attacked France and occupied it, and then Britain would be over here. But in the east, there's the Soviet Union, which is immense. It's a massive country. Now, on June 22nd, 1941, the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, all right? But there's a little backstory to that. It's worth mentioning. It's not that complicated, and don't worry about it. But in 1939, right after Germany, or right before Germany had attacked Poland, Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939. About a week before that, Germany and the Soviet Union made an agreement that they would not fight against each other. So when the Germans attacked Poland, the Soviet Union did nothing. They actually even got a cut. They got a piece of Poland out of it. So the Soviet Union, the communists, the Russians, and the Germans, the fascists, the Nazis, were allies then from 1939 forward. But beginning in 1941, the Russian spies, Russian intelligence, Soviet leaders started to get information that the Germans were sending troops over here, which, would normally mean that they're going to attack, even though they were allies. And they sent like 40 or 50 divisions, close to 2 million troops. So even though they have an agreement, they have a treaty that they will not fight against each other. On June 22nd, 1941, Hitler breaks that. He violates it and attacks the Soviet Union. All right, you can see all these arrows. It is an immense attack. It goes deep into the Soviet Union. So the attack began in June. By December, the Germans, as you can see by these arrows, are way deep into December 5th, 1941, way deep into the Soviet Union. All right, let me see if I can make that a little bigger, if you can see things better. There you go. So this is a huge offensive. Very little resistance coming from the Russians. The two things that actually kind of really helped slow Germany down were in October, there were massive rainstorms for a week or so, and many of the roads in the Soviet Union were still dirt, so they got muddy, and the German offensive had to stop. And then when it got going again in December, Russian winter hit, and you had these brutal below zero temperatures. And the Germans had gone through the Soviet Union so fast, many of them didn't even have winter clothing, winter uniforms. They were still in like cotton. And it was so cold that even, it was like freezing the oil in the tanks and things like that. So by December, even though Germany is deep into the Soviet Union, there's Moscow right here, which is the capital. So imagine, if you're fighting in a war, the other country's capital is really important. So, imagine if somebody was fighting the US and was, 100 miles outside Washington, D.C. or New York City. That's a big deal. So even though they're very close to Moscow, winter hits, and then the Soviet Union was able to kind of rally, get its act together, and then begin a massive counteroffensive. And starting in late 1941, more in 1942, through the next 2 or 3 years, next 2 years especially, the Soviet Union will push the Germans back. And I'll talk about that again because it's really important when it comes especially to things like the Cold War, right? So you have this war on the Eastern Front. Now, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the British and the United States joined forces with the Soviet Union. Now, this was an alliance of convenience. The Americans especially, and the British too, hated the Soviet Union. They were communist, they were Bolshevik, they hated Stalin, but they had the same enemy at this point. So they made this alliance, and the United States began to help the Soviet Union too. It began to send equipment and goods like it had to Britain to the Soviet Union. So now you have this alliance, which includes the British and the Russians, and the Americans are helping them. They're not officially involved, but the Americans are helping them, right? So so that's what's happening in Europe. Now in the Pacific, the other day I told you about Japan's aggression. Japan had invaded China in 1937, but was not able to defeat China. Japan was desperate for resources, especially oil. Japan's big weakness is it didn't have any oil in Japan. So the Japanese began taking over other areas in the Pacific, like the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia. If you've ever seen a Shell gas station, that was part of the Dutch East Indies. Dutch Shell was the national gas company, right? And it got a lot of petroleum from Indonesia. So the Japanese took that over. They occupied it. They took over Indochina, Vietnam, in order to get access to oil there. So Japan was in need of these resources. Japan and the United States were trying to come to an agreement. They're trying to hammer out an agreement on what to do about China. And the United States continued to trade with Japan. But both the Americans and the Japanese believed that China was their most important partner in the Pacific. Now, the Japanese kept saying, well, they're Asian like us. So, they should be part of our sphere of influence, the co-prosperity sphere. And the Americans did not want that because the Japanese would not respect the open door for trade. And everybody wants to be able to trade with China because it's so big, such a huge market. So that was all going on through 1940 and 1941. The Americans and the Japanese are trying to find some way to kind of, avoid going to war against each other. By the fall of 1941, that's increasingly impossible. I was going to say unlikely, but it's really kind of impossible. The U.S. began cutting off trade with Japan, scrap iron, aviation fuel, and finally oil. So by Thanksgiving time of 1941, Japan was increasingly desperate and began planning for a secret attack on American forces. And that occurred on December 7th, 1941 in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, all right? So, and this would be this will be the Japanese, this will be the war in the Pacific in World War II, all right? So the Japanese attacked over here at Pearl Harbor, right here, and then began to attack other areas, all right? So, and this will tell you all that you need to know, phase one, phase two, all that kind of stuff, right? So when Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. Franklin Roosevelt made an address on the radio, and then he got a vote in Congress, and so the United States declared war against Japan. So now you officially have the US, the British, and the Soviet Union on the same side against the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians, all right? So this would be known as the Grand Alliance. Franklin Roosevelt, American president, Winston Churchill, British Prime Minister Joseph Stalin, premier of the Soviet Union. Now, they have very different views and very different goals. Stalin wanted to protect Eastern Europe. He wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining control. The Soviet Union had control of all of this. As it invaded the Soviet Union, it also gained control over all of this. So all of these Eastern European, Central and Eastern European areas are under Nazi control. Stalin wanted to get rid of the Nazis and then make sure that these areas would be safe for the Soviet Union, not have enemy forces there. And when the Cold War comes, that's really important, and I'll go back to that. Churchill wanted essentially to keep the world as it was. The British still had colonies in places like Egypt and India and elsewhere, and they wanted to keep that system. Roosevelt and the Americans wanted to get rid of all that and create an open door world. And if you create an open door world, that means that British colonies have to go as well. Because remember, colonies are closed. You can only trade with countries in your orbit or with the home country, the mother country. So all of that's going on, right? They're on the same side because they have to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. But they don't have a lot in common in a lot of ways either. And that kind of comes clear, and I'm going over the war really quickly. And one of the main ways that comes clear is in the debate over the Second Front. Now, let me, that's the Soviet invasion. Let me see something here. Let me grab let's just grab one of these maps. It'll take a second, but if any of you are interested, there's like a ton of stuff here. So let me see. So I'm looking for a D-Day map. There we go. Wait a minute. 6th June, there we go, Allied invasion. All right, so much of the war was taking place way over here in the East. The Germans were fighting the Russians in the East, and it was these massive battles with millions and millions of troops. What the Soviet Union wanted was for the Americans and the British to begin an attack over here, all right? Germany was in control of France. So Germany had control then of everything in this area, all of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and it included, like Belgium and France, right? So what Stalin wanted the US and the British to do was amass forces in Britain and then cross the English Channel and attack the Germans in France. Why do you do that? If you have millions and millions of forces fighting against the Soviet Union in the East, and then the Americans and the British attack in the West, establish a second front, what do you have to do? I'll give you a second, all right? Because I think you know, right? You'll need to pull a bunch of your troops that are fighting in the Soviet Union, in the Eastern Front, and make them go to the Western Front to fight against the Americans and the British. And that would be better for the Soviet Union. So Stalin immediately wanted that. He asked for that in early 1942. And the British, more than the Americans, kept delaying and delaying and delaying. And that's why the Germans and the Russians kept fighting each other and brutalizing each other. By the time the war was over, the Soviet Union had 20 to 25 million people killed and lost something like 1 million farms and factories were destroyed, and about half of the Soviet economy was wiped out. So the Soviet Union suffered like massive losses in defeating Germany and fighting against and defeating Germany in World War II. So the Soviet Union always believed that the delay in starting an invasion from here was on purpose. They believed that the United States and the British purposely waited so that the Soviet Union and the Germans would beat the hell out of each other, crush each other, bleed each other in the East. And when the Cold War comes after World War II ends, that's going to be a fairly big issue, like what the various contributions of these sides were, all right? So even though in early 1942, Stalin ordered a second war, it didn't happen until June of 1944, the famous D-Day invasion, all right? By that time, the Soviet Union had really hurt and damaged Germany really badly. Germany was in bad shape. They had been in retreat from 1942 on, and the Soviet Union had really started to crush the Germans. The United States was flying air missions over Germany, dropping bombs, which were doing a great deal of destruction as well in places like Dresden. So Germany was getting pretty beaten up already. And then when the D-Day invasion occurred in June of 1944, and these forces began to attack here, and then they would start pushing the Germans back. So in this regard, then after D-Day, you have the British and the Americans, and some French, the French resistance. The British, Americans, and the French resistance were pushing the Germans back towards Central Europe. Over here, the Soviet Union, the Red Army, the Russian forces were pushing Germany back. And then in May of 1945, they met and they defeated Germany, all right? So that's a very quick way to talk about World War II in Europe, all right? So all of that happened. If you're interested, there are actually other things here. Well, I mean, the war took place in many places. I'm going over it very quickly. That's why you need to read the book. There were significant battlefields in Italy, in Yugoslavia, I mean, in Northern Africa, all kinds of stuff like that. Over here, Overlord is the D-Day invasion. And so that enabled the Americans and the British then to push this way toward Germany, while the Soviet Union was over here, the Red Army was over here pushing this way. And then here at the Elbe River, the Russian and American troops met and jointly went into Berlin to take the German surrender, all right? So that's what was happening in Europe, right? Now what's happening in the Pacific, and again, very quickly, I'm going through this stuff really quickly. In the Pacific, after the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 1941, and when that happened, the Japanese naval commander, Admiral Yamamoto, allegedly said, we'll run wild for 6 months, and after that, I don't have any confidence. Other people said, I'm afraid we have awakened a sleeping giant, although I don't know if that's ever been confirmed. The point is that the United States wasn't really prepared for war yet. It had begun building weapons, building ships, building carriers, and so on. But in December of 1941, much of that production wasn't ready yet. However, the Japanese understood that within 6 months or a year, American production would be going at full bore, would be at full speed, and the U.S. would be producing carriers, would be producing fighter planes for carrier-based air power. It would be making destroyers and so on. And so what you have then is that the United States, the first battle that Japan kind of lost was in Midway in 1942. And this is kind of the turning of the tide. From that point on, the US and the Japanese fought battles in a lot of these little areas. They called it island hopping. Japan had taken control of these areas that wanted to create the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So the Japanese took control of the Philippines and the Saipan and Guam and all of these places. Tarawa, you can kind of see them on the map here. And then the United States, and also on islands outside of the Japanese mainland. Here's Japan. Japan is an archipelago, and it has these islands like Okinawa that are Iwo Jima that are off the mainland. So all of these places were being fought over throughout from 42 to 45. At the same time, the United States was flying air missions over Japan too, like it was in Germany, and it was using, in both Germany and Japan, it was using napalm bombs. Napalm is a gel that's gas, and so when it hits the ground, it sprays all over and it catches fire, and you have fire bombings, entire city blocks, areas like a square mile burn because of these attacks. And the United States was doing this in places like Dresden, Germany, and Tokyo, Japan, with huge destruction, huge numbers of people killed. So by mid-1945, the war in Europe was over. The United States and the Soviet Union had met at the Elbe River and gone in to Berlin in May and forced Germany to surrender. By mid-1945, Japan was in desperate shape as well. All right. So what did that mean? How did the war end then? Well, I'm not going to go into this too much, all right, because I have something for you guys to listen to on this. And I'm not going to play it here. You have to do it on your own time. The war in the Pacific ended with the atomic bomb, all right? Now, normally I would go into a fairly long explanation of why the atomic bomb was used, why it was important, and all that kind of stuff. And there's a big outline here, which you should check, right? You should be familiar with that. There's an article here about nuclear war, but, it's in the, hold on a second, I forgot. The link is actually on the syllabus, not on the outlines. I'll need to put it on there. But for the atomic bomb lesson, go to right here. Oh, no, not that one. That's here we go. Go to the podcast on atomic bomb right here, all right? And I'll put this link on the outlines as well. And listen to that. A friend and I did a podcast a month or two ago where we went into detail about the atomic bomb. It's way better for you just to listen to that. It's about 40 minutes long. And that way, rather than me kind of talking about it here and trying to go through it quickly, you can get this conversation about it, which I think will be a lot easier to figure out, okay? So listen to that. The atomic bomb ended World War II. It forced the Japanese to surrender. It ended the war, all right? And that would lead then to the Cold War. So to recap, and I just flew through World War II, the United States principal contribution to World War II was through production. It began creating this arsenal for democracy, like around 1938 or so, helped the US get out of the Depression. But 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, America's main role was to build weapons, to build ships, to build planes, to build stuff that they could then, give to other countries or lease to other countries or sell to other countries to fight against Germany and Japan. All right, that was America's main responsibility until Pearl Harbor. Then the US got involved in the war. Now, in the Pacific, the US played a dominant role in defeating Japan. In Europe, the war was mostly between the Soviet Union and the Germans. The Americans and the British fought. They came in later, and D-Day wasn't established until, kind of close to the end of the war. So by the time that Europe was, settled, Germany was defeated, Japan was close to being defeated as well. And that happened not long after that, a few months after that, which is important. The timeline is kind of important here. That's why I have this up here. And when you listen to the podcast, you'll understand why. So in August 1945, then the war's over. Germany had been defeated in May, and now Japan was forced to surrender in August of 1945. So World War II is over. This is obviously a huge event in global history. In the 20th century, World War II is massive. It creates a whole new world. It changes stuff all over the world, in Europe, in Asia. The United States was a strong country, because of World War I. But what World War II did was create the United States as the global superpower, the global hegemon. Hegemon is a word that means you have power, hegemonic, right? So World War II ended with the US having global power. It also brought on the Cold War. And, if we were in class, we talk about that. What's the Cold War? I don't know if, students know much about it or if they've heard the term. Generally, and I'm going to kind of have a dialogue with myself here, but generally when we talk about the Cold War, I'd say, what's the Cold War? And most people would say, well, it's this battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Americans and the communists, democracy and communism, however you want to define it. And the Soviet Union and the communists are trying to take over the world, and the US is defending freedom. That's the main story. That's the main narrative that you're likely to get if you just like talk to somebody, or if you did a Google search, or if you looked at a kind of a typical book. Most of the time, the Cold War would be described as this battle that occurred after World War II between the Americans and the communists, because the communists were trying to take over the world, and the Americans had to fight and defend freedom against them. So even though they were on the same side during World War II, remember, the Americans and the Russians were allies. Joe Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt were allies during World War II. They were on the same side because they were fighting against Germany. Once Germany was defeated, the basis of that relationship is basically over, right? It was kind of a convenient relationship because they had to fight against Germany. Now, Germany's defeated, and the Americans can go back to their other ideas about creating this kind of open door world, creating an American economic empire, and seeing the Soviet Union, these communists, as the enemy. The Soviet Union and the U.S. were enemies, except for that 4-year period during World War II. Otherwise, they were always in conflict with one another, and that conflict is going to really escalate at the end of World War II. All right. Now I'm going to go back to this because it's important. Now this is just a basic map, right, of the United States and North America and Europe and Africa, right. This is this red will be communist countries. Now this is the Soviet Union over here. As the Soviet Union began to fight against Germany and push them back in 1942, remember the Germans had gone well into the Soviet Union, close to Moscow. And then the Soviet Union began to fight back. And so 1942, 1943, 1944, the Red Army is pushing the Germans back, further away. When they did this, these countries had all been taken over by the Nazis. When the Red Army defeated the Nazis, these countries then were liberated, right? They weren't under Nazi control. The Red Army removed the German appointed governments, the Nazi governments there. But it left communist governments in charge. So by 1945, then half of Europe, this part of Europe over Eastern Europe, is controlled by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, remember, I said Stalin's goal was to provide security against another invasion. Russia had been invaded in 1914 to start World War I, and then in 1941 to start World War II. So Stalin's idea here is that as the Red Army defeats the Germans, it will keep communist governments in place here. It will keep occupation forces to protect those communist governments in place in order to prevent this area from becoming dangerous to the Soviet Union, like it was when Germany was in control of it. And also to get the economic benefits of this area as well. So the Soviet Union, by having control of this area, has access to coal and steel and raw materials and labor and all that kind of stuff too. So the Soviet Union by 1945 had authority over this area, all right? The rest of the world was basically capitalist or democratic or American, however you want to define it, all right? So the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were red. The rest of the world was basically American, all right? And, I don't know if this I think kind of over time changes, does it? Yeah, you can kind of see that 1960, 61 and all that kind of stuff. So, you have other, like by 1982, you have, Cuba's communist, right? Or 1960, where it wasn't in 1945, but it changes. But in 1945, this is kind of the way the world looks. So you have Europe, which is basically controlled by the Soviet Union, or at least it has those Soviet influenced or Soviet dominated communist governments. And then the rest of the globe is basically allied to the United States and is part of this capitalist global economy, all right? So that's what the world looks like. Now, what's the Cold War? All right, the Cold War, like I said, is often portrayed as this idea that the Soviet Union was trying to take over the world and the US had to stop them. So it kind of takes on the aspects of a morality issue. It's an epic battle between good and evil. That's the way it's presented in the United States. The United States will say, the constant rhetoric from 1945 on is that the Soviet Union is trying to take over the world. The Soviet Union is evil. The communists are trying to take over America. They're trying to destroy your freedom. The Soviet Union wants control over, all of these areas in the world, all of Europe, Asia, and everywhere else. So The United States has a responsibility then to defend democracy, to defend freedom, to defend liberty, and fight against the Soviet Union. So it's good and evil, right? Now, the reality, and we've talked about this before, when you listen to the podcast on the atomic bomb, you'll get that too, because at the very beginning, I talk about the way people look at the atomic bomb, what their basic attitudes were. In the same way, when you talk about the Cold War, most Americans support the United States in the Cold War. They basically accepted this idea that the Soviet Union was dangerous, it was trying to take over the world, and the United States had to protect freedom and goodness and all that kind of stuff against these evil communists who are trying to take everything over. So most people believe that. That's the typical narrative, right? Now, as we know, the typical narrative often is not the most reliable or accurate one, and that's the case here as well. There are a couple things going on in the Cold War. Before I do that, though, let me point out that the Cold War, well, basically, the Cold War is a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, between capitalist democracy and the Soviet Union and communism, all right? Now, even though they were allies, the Americans and the Russians had issues in World War II, and I've mentioned some of them already. The Second Front, where Stalin wanted a second front in 1942, and it didn't happen until 1944, which contributed to the massive, massive losses the Soviet Union took. 20, 25 million people killed. There was a debate over the atomic bomb. There were arguments over the atomic bomb, remember, and you'll hear about this when you listen to the podcast. The Soviet Union and the United States were allies, but there's a good argument that the United States actually was using the atomic bomb to send a signal to the Soviet Union. Basically one that says, we have a bomb, you don't, so don't mess with us, all right? There were also disagreements over who should control the Italian surrender. Don't worry about that, all right? So the conflict is already, the relationship is kind of falling apart already during World War II because of the Second Front and the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union and the United States are starting to kind of conflict with each other and have different ideas, right? And then as the Soviet Union moves into Eastern Europe and leaves occupation forces in those countries, this red stuff here, the Cold War gets even more intense. It heats up even more, all right? So why is that? Well, the Soviet Union's main goal is to have a secure zone in Eastern Europe. It wants friendly governments in Eastern Europe. That's why it left all the occupation forces there. That's why that map is all red. The American goal in the Cold War is the same one as it was before World War II, which is to establish an open door world with American power, all right? So the United States then is going to say, the Soviet Union's trying to take over and we have to stop them. The reality, however, is that the United States is trying to create an open door world. And the Soviet Union, especially the Soviet control over Eastern Europe, stands in the way of that. The US wants to have access to those Eastern European countries. They don't want the Soviet Union controlling them. They want to be able to get into those countries and trade and make stuff and sell stuff and buy stuff and invest and all that kind of stuff too, all right? So it's clear then that some kind of conflict is inevitable. And even before World War II ended, as I said, you have the Second Front and the atomic bomb. In February of 1942, there was a meeting between the United States, the British, and the Soviet Union at Yalta, which is in the Crimea. And they started to talk about what was going to happen at the end of World War II. And the two main issues were Poland and Germany, right? Poland was liberated by the Soviet Union, but then the Soviet Union established a communist government in Poland, all right? The United States was quite upset about that. It's just a map of it. The United States was quite upset and believed that Poland should have free elections, that they should not have a communist government. However, the United States really wasn't in any kind of position to force the Soviet Union to get out of Poland, right? Again, look at this map. And because this is going to be a real issue, a lot of people will say, well, the US was weak. They let the Soviet Union take over all of these places, right? The reality, however, is that the Soviet Union did this at the end of World War II as it was liberating these areas. So by the time the Soviet Union had occupation forces and taken control of all this and turned it red, America's options were pretty limited. I mean, was it going to go to war against the Soviet Union in 1945? The Soviet Union and America were still allies. Would you go to war over this? So the U.S. didn't have a whole lot of options there. So Poland remained a communist country. Germany was a little different. What they decided to do on Germany was to cut it up, to divide it into four different areas, right? So you have four different zones, and then Britain is in control of this area up here. The United States is in control of this area here. The French were in control of this here. And then the Soviet Union got control of this, all right? Now, if you look at Germany, this area here is where the industry is. This is where the resources are. So the best part of Germany, the most valuable and productive part of Germany was controlled by the Americans and the British and the French. And remember, the French caved to Germany. They were occupied, yet they got part of Germany to be in control of, right? The part here that the Soviet Union got was mostly agricultural, right? So Stalin was not happy. In his way of thinking, the Soviet Union had defeated the Germans. 80% of the German forces killed in World War II were killed by the Red Army. So as Stalin sees it, he had begun in 1942 pushing these German forces back, and finally defeated them with huge losses, 25 million, massive disparity in losses. The United States had about 350,000 killed in World War II. And the Soviet Union, like I said, had 20 to 25 million. Yet, when the war ended, all the Soviet Union got, as Stalin saw, was this area here, right? He wanted this because he believed that he'd be rewarded. The Soviet Union had taken these huge losses, made these huge sacrifices, so they should have control over these more productive areas of Germany where you could get coal, where you could make steel and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't. So this also contributes to the bad feelings then between the United States and the Soviet Union that are going to make the Cold War worse, right? The U.S. is unhappy that the Soviet Union is in control of Poland, and the Soviet Union is unhappy that all it got out of Germany was this little section here, this zone here, when the Americans and the British and the French got the far better area over here. And the point here is that there's conflict. These countries are allies, but things are starting to fall apart fairly rapidly as soon as World War II ends, right? So that's going to lead to the Cold War. Now, as I said, the Cold War is looked at as this battle between the good Americans who are trying to save the world and the evil Russians who are trying to take everything over, all right? And that's the way it's presented. That's the way the Americans sell it. That's the way the American media talks about it. That's the way history books generally talk about it even now, right? But there's a lot more to that, all right? As I said before, these countries have different goals, right? Winston Churchill and the British want to maintain the British Empire. Joe Stalin and the Soviet Union want defense. They want to defend their country by having control over those areas so that Germany can't attack through them again, and also to have control over the economic resources of that region. And the United States wants the open door, all right? There is also really important to note here, there is also a huge disparity in power at the end of the war between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the end of the war, the US was overwhelmingly more powerful than anyone else. The United States lost about 350,000 men and women killed. The Soviet Union, 20 to 25 million. Germany, I think like 12 million. China, 20, 25 million. Japan, huge losses. And the war was not fought in the United States. The only American area that was even hit was Pearl Harbor. So the United States came out of World War II in way better shape than anybody else. The production for the war had ended the Depression. The American economy was now firing on all cylinders, right? There were factories that were being opened now all the time because the production was needed. The US didn't take huge losses. The United States loaned money to other countries. And the United States came out of the war in much better shape, whereas these other countries were wiped out. And especially when you talk about the Cold War, the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union lost 20 to 25 million people dead, 1 million farms and factories destroyed, and half its economy just wiped out, right? So these two sides are not equal. This is not an equal rivalry between, the Americans and the Soviet Union. They're at the same level, not at all. The United States is way, way more powerful. It's up here and the Soviet Union's down here. So the idea that the Soviet Union was trying to take over the world, which is really dominant in the American public explanations of the Cold War, wasn't really based in reality. And the Americans knew that. The U.S. understood how much more powerful it was than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union also understood that it was much less powerful, much weaker than the United States. So this epic battle between good and evil really wasn't. It was a battle between the Americans, who were trying to create this open door world, and the Soviet Union, which wanted to retain control of Eastern Europe for economic and security reasons, right? And the United States not only wanted the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, the United States wanted to create a hegemonic situation all over the globe, all right? The real goal here is hegemony. And I mentioned that word a couple times. Hegemony is power. It means that you are the dominant power. If you have hegemony, if you're hegemonic, you have more power than anybody else, right? So the United States wanted to do that. It wanted to create global power. It's the only country to come out of the war in much better shape. Everybody else is reeling. Everybody else is suffering from the war. The United States, however, was better off. And so it wanted to create a new system so that its power would grow and grow and grow, and the US would be the dominant country in the world at the end of the Cold War. That's the idea behind the Cold War. It's a war for dominance, for hegemony, for power, for economic markets, for countries that are going to be friendly to you, countries that will trade with you, countries that will invest or will let you invest, all right? So the Cold War is a battle for economic power throughout the globe, economic and political power throughout the globe, right? The idea that the Soviet Union was trying to take over the world was critical to America's approach to the Cold War. They kept saying that. They had to say that, right? They had to rationalize it. They had to justify it. Soviet Union's trying to take over the world. We have to stop them. And that means we're going to have to do whatever it takes to stop them. We're going to have to build more weapons. We're going to have to spend more money on the military. We're going to have to get involved in the affairs of other countries in order to make sure they don't become communist and so on, right? So the United States is able to use this threat of the Soviet Union, wildly exaggerated as it was. The Soviet Union was not in a position to dominate the world. The Soviet Union had control of Eastern Europe, that red part on the map I showed you a few minutes ago, because it had left occupation forces there at the end of World War II. The Soviet Union was not in any position to take over other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. The United States was way too powerful, way stronger than the Soviet Union. The US knew it was stronger than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union knew that it was weaker than the United States. So despite the rhetoric, they're not going to get involved in a major conflict. It's just not going to happen because the Soviet Union is going to avoid that. And the United States is pretty much aware of that as well. The US knew that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be adventurous and risky, but they needed that rhetoric to keep people kind of motivated for this Cold War. You know, one way to motivate people is through fear. You use fear. You create these scenarios where, you know, people are at risk, right? The Russians are going to come in, the communists are going to come in, they're going to take over, they're going to enslave the American people, they're going to, you know, destroy your churches, they're going to take away your liberty, they're going to take away your freedom. That was the rhetoric at the end of World War II during the Cold War. The communists are evil and they're going to, you know, they're atheists, they're, you know, the atheistic communists. That was often how they were described, atheist communists. They're going to come in and, you know, you increase this fear of them, right? You terrify people. It's like, you know, people crossing the border, look at what they're going to do. We have to build a wall, or, you know, we can't let Arabs in the country, you know, that kind of thing. So this is common throughout American history. You know, at the end of World War II, it's communist. You know, it was Reds at the end of World War I. You know, after 9/11, you've had this kind of fear of Arabs and Muslims. Today with Trump, it's like, you know, whoever he tweets about on this particular day. So this idea of getting people worked up over a perceived threat is really critical to getting Americans to support your policies. And sometimes those policies are very aggressive, as they were in the Cold War, right? So the United States then is trying to create this global system in which America is the dominant country, all right? There's a very famous diplomat named George Kennan, an American, very well known, an expert on the Soviet Union, and he wrote an analysis. He wrote a kind of a, you know, a research paper, almost like, you know, comparing the United States and the Soviet Union and talking about you know, what they were likely to do. And George Kennan wrote, and this is a little after World War II ended. George Kennan wrote, the United States has 6% of the world's population, but controls 50% of the wealth. So that's massive, right? The US is only 6% of the population. Today it's about 5%. Yet 50% of the wealth, imagine that. A small country, relatively, 5% of the population controls 50% of wealth. So that's what Kennan said. The US has 5% of the, or 6% of the world's population, yet controls 50% of the wealth. Our task in the coming years is to devise strategies to maintain this position of disparity. Those are 6 important words. To maintain this position of disparity. That's the American goal, to maintain this position of disparity, right? You know what disparity means? Some of you probably do, you all probably do, right? Disparity means the difference, right? The gap. So America's goal, according to Kennan, because the United States has overwhelming power, 6% of the population, 50% of the wealth. Think about that, that's massive. Think if like you're in a room of 100 people and you're one of 6 people that controls half the wealth in that entire room. So let's say there's $1 million worth of wealth, or $10 million, it doesn't matter, whatever, right? In that room, 6 of you will control $500,000 of that wealth, and the other 94 will have, the same amount. So it's a massive gap. That's what Kennan wanted to do. Kennan didn't say our task in the coming years is to feed hungry nations, or to create democracy, or to develop countries that are poor, or to rebuild. He didn't say anything like that. The task in the coming years is to maintain this disparity, to maintain this gap, to make sure that that gap where the United States has 50% of the world's wealth with only 6% of the population continues, right? So the American goal is to get power and maintain power and keep power and maybe even make power expand. So that's the American purpose in the Cold War. It's to maintain this position of disparity. It's to create programs that help America grow and get more powerful and more wealthy economically and politically, all right? So the United States has to devise then strategies in order to do this. The United States goal is nothing short of global power, taking over and being the most powerful country in the world. And it was at the end of World War II, absolutely. The US had a massive run for the rest of the 20th century, where the United States dominated global politics. I mean, today, the US is still overwhelmingly powerful. The US spends more on the military than like the next 14 countries combined, including China. The American economy, which is taking a lot of hits, especially with the tariffs, is still very powerful. The dollar is still used all over the world for business. So the US still has significant economic power. But, at the end of World War II, it was massive. So the United States wanted to create this system where it had economic and political hegemony. Now, most people will argue that power is based on the military, right? You have bigger armies, you have more weapons, you have more naval ships. Now, that's clearly important, and the US clearly had military power at the end of World War II. The United States had especially one thing that the Soviet Union did not have. The US had atomic bombs, and the Soviet Union did not. So when you listen to the podcast about the atomic bomb, keep that in mind. So the United States clearly has military power. And the United States, as I said before, didn't suffer and get crushed in World War II like the Europeans did. So the United States is in pretty good shape, and the factories are still open, and whereas Europe has been just destroyed. Germany was wiped out in the war, air power, airplanes, Germany, Dresden in Germany, Tokyo in Japan. Britain was wiped out by the German attack. So Europe's in bad shape, and Asia's in bad shape. The United States isn't. So the United States is in pretty good shape. It's solid. Its economy is the biggest in the world. So it needs to develop strategies. Military strength is clearly important. It'd be foolish to say it isn't, but even more important is creating economic power. And what the United States did, and this is not the most interesting, exciting thing. I hate to break it to you. I'd rather be in a classroom because this is a lot more fun there. You can walk around and try to make jokes and stuff like that. But it's nonetheless important, and this is really important to read. And I think in these pages in the book will probably be really useful to you. So the United States wanted to create economic power, and it did this in 1944. And this may be the most important element of the Cold War. More than anything, I think this is how the United States developed and maintained and even expanded its power throughout the Cold War. It did so through creating a new economic system. And this was called the Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods is like a resort in New Hampshire. And in 1944, all of these very important people from all over Europe, all over the world, got together to discuss the economic system at the end, the global economic system at the end of World War II. All right. Keynes was there, the guy who had been in charge of the reparations at Versailles, right? The Americans were there, all of these countries were there. What they did at Bretton Woods was create a new global economic system, a system that would enable the United States to have overwhelming power, a system that would enable the United States to use that economic power, the ability to make loans to people, to other countries, to its benefit. One of the key elements in global power, global politics, is to be able to get other countries in debt to you. Debt is a form of control over another place, right? Now, at the end of World War II, there's a lot of countries that need money because they've been beaten up so badly. The World War II was very destructive. So the United States began to create institutions that it could use to provide aid to other countries. When you provide aid, you do it with all kinds of conditions attached so that you can use that aid as a form of control, right? I mean, if you've ever taken out a big loan, you know what that's like, right? You have to pay it back. If you don't pay it back on time, there'll be penalties, and they can call it in and all that kind of stuff. So, if you have a big loan, then you're in debt, which means that the people who hold your credits, the bank or whoever, has some level of control over your economic situation, maybe a lot of control over your economic situation if you're too much in debt, right? If you have nothing but debts, then, you're in pretty much, you're in a perilous situation. You're in a dangerous situation. So the United States did three things at Bretton Woods, and I'll try to be quick with these because they're in the book, all right? It created an institution that's still around today called the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And essentially, these are banks. These are kind of like banks, right? The International Monetary Fund was a fund established for what was called currency stabilization. World War II, there's a difference between monetary and fiscal policies, right? Monetary policies generally deal with things like money and currency, all right? Not necessarily building stuff or making things or programs. In World War II, and I make sure you read the book on this because I'm not going to go through it really quick in detail. In World War II, European countries found themselves with a lot of currency in crisis. Their money wasn't worth much. They ran up massive debts. They couldn't pay public workers. So their currencies were in a sense of crisis, right? Inflation was super high. So their money wasn't worth much, right? So what are you going to do in a situation like that? If your money isn't worth much, if you have runaway inflation, you used to buy a lunch for $10 and now it costs $100, right? So you need someone to come in and stabilize your currency, make loans to you, and put programs into effect so that your money is now worth something again, or your debts are paid, or you can pay your public workers, right? And read the book on this because it's explained much more clearly there, right? So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, becomes the agency to do that. Countries can go to the IMF, which is dominated by the United States, and they can borrow money for currency stabilization, all right? So you can go there and say, look, the war has kicked our butts. We have massive inflation. Our currency isn't worth anything. We have all these debts to pay. We can't pay our workers, our public workers. We can't pay our teachers and the, the cleaning men and the, the cab drivers or whatever. So we need a loan. So that's what the IMF does. Now, it gives these loans out. So you clearly have control. You have power. When you're able to extend credit and put somebody in debt, you have power over that person or that country. So the IMF does that. And it doesn't just give this money out either. There are clearly conditions for these loans. So if you're a country that was hit hard in World War II, your treasury is running a deficit, or you have massive inflation, or you don't have money to pay your workers, you go to the IMF and you say, can we have $50 million to stabilize our currency, to kind of get things back on a regular basis. And even if you don't understand the details of currency, the idea of stabilization is pretty simple, right? You want to stabilize things. So, you take a loan out from the IMF, but that money isn't just given to them. You don't just throw a stack of money at these countries. You make them agree to certain circumstances. IMF aid was available to countries that had a privately held economic system, right? So it had to be, the economy had to be privately controlled, like the United States. which meant that socialist countries, countries with public ownership of industry or public ownership of major factories or public ownership of transportation, were not going to get IMF loans. So IMF loans were available to other capitalist countries in a private market economy. Now, that's a way to help your friends and to hurt your enemies. That meant that socialist countries like the Soviet Union weren't going to get aid from the IMF. Communist countries in Eastern Europe, which were wiped out during World War II as well, weren't going to get aid from the IMF as a way to help your friends. Sure, we'll help you. We'll give you these loans, but you have to allow us to have a role in your economy. So if you take a loan from the IMF, then more likely than not, you're going to have American bankers in your country operating, trying to organize these loans, trying to carry them out, execute them, taking a role, taking a piece of those loans. So the IMF enables Western banks, American banks, to gain, and American companies to gain more power in these other places like Europe by giving them loans for currency stabilization. So it uses the ability to offer credit as a way to gain power, right? Which makes sense. That's not a difficult concept, right? If you're in desperate need of $100,000 for who knows what, and somebody pops up and says, "Hey, I can loan you that money," then you kind of have to take it. And if you do that, then you're kind of have to do what the creditor says. All right. So it's a difficult situation. And the United States uses it to American advantage by gaining control by offering these loans for currency stabilization. Right. So the IMF is still around, and so is the World Bank. Now, the World Bank, you might have heard of it before. The World Bank was created for reconstruction and development. So currency stabilization deals with money, debt, and inflation and things like that. Reconstruction and development deals with the physical elements of a country. Reconstruction means reconstruction, right? Just like after the Civil War, the South had to reconstruct. Europe has to be rebuilt, reconstructed at the end of World War II. Development is more for smaller countries which are trying to expand their economies. So, but in both cases, it means you want to develop the physical resources needed to get back on your feet or to grow. So in the case of Europe, reconstruction would mean you need money to literally rebuild the streets, remove the rubble, rebuild highways, rebuild a communication system, maybe put in clean water facilities if they've been bombed, right? So all of that stuff is reconstruction. It's easy. It's like in World War II. I'm sorry. It's like in the Civil War, at the end of in the South, at the end of the Civil War, reconstruction. Right? You need to rebuild. So you physically need funds to help you rebuild from the destruction of the war. Development would be more for probably smaller countries, and that's for countries so that they can develop their economies in order to grow. So development might be a small country saying, you know what, we're in the Caribbean, and we could create a really nice tourist industry, but we need airfields and airports built. And we can't afford to do that. So in these cases, let's say you're a small country wanting to build an airfield to entice people to come for tourism, or you're a country that was wiped out during the war and you need to reconstruct, you can go to the World Bank and you can borrow money there, all right? So again, these are both basically banks. They're ways for you to purchase or to get loans, to get credit in order to either stabilize your currency in the case of the IMF, or reconstruct and develop your economies in the case of the World Bank. And again, in both these cases, the aid comes with strings attached. If you want money from the IMF or the World Bank, you have to be a capitalist economy, an economy in which the means of production, the factories and the machines and the railroads and the banks and everything are owned by private individuals, not by the state. Socialist countries cannot get loans. They cannot get aid. So it's a way to help your friends, right? And to hurt your enemies. So if you're a small country, you want to build a tourist industry, you want to build airfields, you go to the World Bank. So at that point, you are in debt then to the World Bank, to the United States. Also, like in the IMF, would send bankers to these other countries. The World Bank would often send American companies to these other countries. In fact, quite often when you get a loan, one of the conditions of that loan is that you purchase services and goods back from the creditor. So if you get a loan from the World Bank, then let's say you want a loan to rebuild your urban areas, right? The cities have been wiped out by all the bombings, and you need to rebuild the highways, and you need to rebuild electricity, and you need to rebuild the water system. So, the World Bank might say, yeah, we can give you this money. And by the way, there's a company called Kellogg Brown and Root, or Brown and Root, or, Halliburton, right? And they can help you out. Or, hey, there's the General Electric can help you with that problem. Or, hey, General Motors can help you with that problem. Or, Citibank or Goldman Sachs can help you with that problem. So as part of the loan, you are then obliged to purchase services and goods back from the creditor, right? So in both of these cases, the IMF and the World Bank, the United States is able to extend money to countries in need and use that to gain more control over the global economy. Those countries are now in debt to the United States. The US is in control of those countries in the sense that it can kind of force them to make economic decisions that the United States wants them to make. All right, and again, read this stuff. The last thing, which is a little more complex, and again, read it, is at Bretton Woods, all of these countries decided that the American dollar would be a global currency. All right, and it would be convertible. Their local economies would be able to be converted to dollars. What does that mean? Without going into all the detail of this, because I'm not that concerned about it. It's an important issue, and it's still important today because the dollar is still the world's kind of dominant currency. You want your currency to be a global currency. This way, people need dollars. If you want to trade or buy stuff or sell stuff, right, you can do it in dollars. So that means the whole world, whether you have Italian lira, French francs, German marks, the British pound, all of these countries now will need dollars in order to conduct trade, and they can convert their currency into dollars as well, right? The importance there is that it gives the United States massive economic power because everybody wants dollars. Think of if you're in a room, again, if you're in a room of 100 people and all of you have your own currency, you've all invented your own currency, you get out a little piece of paper, a little nice little artwork, and you create your own dollar bills or your own $1,000 bills or whatever. You would want everyone else in the room to use your money, right? It would make your money more valuable. Right? So if you decide, if everybody in the room decides to use your money instead of mine, then my money's worthless. Your money, however, has great value because everybody wants it. So in that regard, everybody wanted to use the dollar, which made the dollar stronger. So all of these things are really vital in creating this post-war economic hegemony for the United States. 6% of the world's population, yet 50% of the wealth, and the task was to keep that going. The task wasn't to feed the poor or to help people live better or to create education or to eradicate malaria or anything like that, right? There were programs for those things, but the goal, as Ken described it, was to maintain this position of disparity, to keep that gap with the United States being overwhelmingly wealthy and powerful and everybody else looking up to the United States, borrowing money from the United States, borrowing money from the IMF or the World Bank, and using dollars for their trade. Okay, we're well into the origins of the Cold War. I'll stop here. Read the book. I've said that every time. Read the book. Be careful that you understand this stuff because, like a lot of times in these classes, especially, it could be a little less clear because we're not in class talking and walking around and all that kind of stuff. If you have any questions, check Blackboard, check in with the TAs, and we'll be on top of things in terms of exams and extra credit and all that. This was class 11, so we're in pretty good shape, and stay in touch if you have any questions. Continue to do your work, read the book, be safe. Enjoy the weather now that it's not quite as bad, and we'll have another one of these up soon. That'll be lecture 12, so we're making good progress. I'll have somewhere, I don't know, probably in the high 20s by the end of the semester. There'll probably be, I don't know exactly how many there'll be, but let me just say a ballpark figure would be like between 25 and 30. All right. But we'll always tell you, where you need to be in with regard to the classes, right? So now, you should be doing your reading up through the Cold War stuff. You should be aware of that and on top of that, and do it now so that you don't have to like spend the 48 hours before the exam like watching videos and trying to read everything, because you don't want to leave all that for the last minute. All right. Good talking to you again. Check in with the TAs if you have any questions. Check Blackboard, check the syllabus. Make sure you listen to that podcast on the atomic bomb that's on the syllabus, and I'll send out an announcement about that as well, just to remind you. And enjoy yourselves. Be safe. Wear masks and gloves and hats and whatever else you need. And take care, and we'll see you again soon.